Hello, and welcome to the Europe at War podcast.
Episode 2.6, The Final Phase. We finished off last week's episode with the German counterattacking forces managing to finally break the Soviet siege of Bautzen. And once the siege had been lifted, the German forces, having linked up with the garrison defenders, then focused on expelling the remaining enemy troops from the city. Elsewhere in Saxony, meanwhile, the wider German counterattack had also enjoyed some key successes, including the recapture of the vital town of Weissenberg and the annihilation of the Soviet garrison who had been tasked with defending Weissenberg. Buoyed by these victories, the Germans now turned their attention to the remaining Soviet and Polish forces still positioned to the north of Bautzen. Because the Germans knew they had no hope of reaching southern Brandenburg or Berlin unless they first smashed the Soviet and Polish armies blocking their way in northern Saxony. And before we get started, just a heads up, I've added a new map to the description of this episode to help you visualize the movements on the battlefield, which I will be describing in today's episode. As morning broke on the 25th of April, sporadic gunfire could still be heard rolling around Bautzen, punctuated by the odd muffled explosion of grenades, as German battle groups swept through houses and cellars, rooting out any Soviet pockets of resistance still clinging on in the city. Once any Soviet group was found, they were dispatched ruthlessly, and more often than not, any time a Soviet soldier tried to surrender, they were executed, particularly if they were wounded. These mopping up operations were conducted mainly by the remaining Bautzen garrison troops, but they were also supported by battle groups such as the Wittesheim Kampfgruppe, led by Captain Walter von Wittesheim. This battle group would develop a merciless reputation for rooting out stubborn Soviet soldiers, and once they had cleaned up Bautzen, this battle group would also go on to play a key role in the fighting outside of the city over the next few days. Despite these mopping up operations, overall control of Bautzen was firmly in German hands, and as the Soviets pulled back, they reviewed the heavy price they had paid for their failure to capture the city. It's estimated that in the fighting within Bautzen alone, the Soviets lost at least 1,500 men, 4 assault guns, and dozens of tanks. Also, the strongest fighting units of the 7th Guards Mechanized Corps had been annihilated in the fighting. And after this unit's twin defeats in Bautzen and Weissenberg, the unit reported the loss of between 80 to 90% of its men and vehicles. The losses for the Polish forces around Bautzen were not as high, of course, given that they only supported the Soviet assault on the city towards the end of the fighting. But even their attempted counterattacks to dislodge the Germans from the city had led to a high number of casualties, particularly for the Polish 1st Armoured Corps. The Germans, meanwhile, had obviously not come through the fighting in Bautzen unscathed, not least of all the Bautzen garrison itself, which had lost at least 1,200 men in the battle. And numerous civilians had also been killed in the crossfire between the German and Soviet forces. The streets of Bautzen were full of bodies, burnt-out husks of tanks, bloodied animal carcasses, debris, and shattered glass. The city was essentially an open morgue, and the horrific scenes of death and decay were ripe breeding grounds for disease. The sources report that the first priority in terms of burying the dead was made for German soldiers and civilians. But in any case, with sporadic fighting still breaking out throughout the city, it would be days before the process of cleaning up could properly begin. As a temporary measure, many of the dead were buried in mass graves, such as on the corn market in the center of the city. Here, 15 victims of the fighting were buried in a large pit, with the bodies only exhumed for reburial in November 1945. But the cost of the fighting mattered little to the German leadership, who, desperate for any piece of good news in the final weeks of the war, latched on to the victory in Bautzen. Hitler congratulated Field Marshal Schörner on the relief of Bautzen, and the Nazi propaganda machine went into overdrive, trumpeting the German triumph in the city as an important step in the defense of the fatherland. Let's see how well that turns out. With the main fighting in Bautzen over, the German High Command ordered the 1st Hermann Göring Division, the 20th Panzer Division, and the Brandenburg Division to launch a new armoured thrust north of Bautzen, as part of that overall drive to push into southern Brandenburg and ultimately rescue Berlin. The 1st Hermann Göring Division took up the left flank of this advance, and the 20th Panzer Division took up the right flank, with both being supported by infantry from the Brandenburg Division. As these German units started their advance northwards of Bautzen, the remaining forces of the Soviet 7th Guards Mechanized Corps had little option but to conduct a fighting retreat. Their goal, to reach the safety of the strong Red Army defensive lines which had been established by the 14th and 95th Guards Rifle Divisions and the 4th Guards Tank Division, who had all been sent south to support the battered Polish and Soviet forces in the Bautzen area. And the Germans were determined to put those new defences to the test. At 1 p.m. in the afternoon of the 25th of April, the Germans launched themselves at the villages of Teichnitzsch and Kleinwelke, 3 kilometers north of Bautzen, where the remnants of the 24th and 26th Guards Mechanized Brigades had hastily erected defences. For the assault on these villages, the Germans assembled an attack force consisting of 400 men, 15 tanks, and 5 armoured vehicles. The mixed Polish-Soviet units positioned in the villages had no intention of letting the Germans pass, and they resisted bitterly. But at 3 p.m., a phalanx of German Panther tanks, supported by Panzer Grenadiers, successfully broke through, scattering the Polish-Soviet troops. The Germans then capitalized on this success by taking the villages of Radibor and Groß-Dubrow, 10 kilometers north of Bautzen. And to the northwest of Bautzen, the Germans successfully assaulted the villages of Großwelke and Kues with a force of Tiger tanks, overwhelming the Polish and Soviet defenders, forcing them to retreat to the village of Luppe further north. Despite these successes, however, the Germans were having to engage in savage combat with the Polish and Soviet troops, and each small village saw furious street battles and close quarters fighting. Even when the Germans were victorious in capturing a village, they were soon subjected to fierce counterattacks. The outcome of all of this was that, rather than thrusting towards Spremberg in a blitzkrieg-style attack, the German forces were instead having to slog their way through the northern Saxony countryside, which slowed down the German advance so much that it put paid to any hopes that they would be able to break into Brandenburg and Berlin quickly. To the east of Saxony, the battered Polish 7th and 10th Infantry Divisions, which had been cut off completely from the rest of the Polish Second Army, fought tenaciously to reach the town of Spreefeld, today known as Poised, securing the road to the town of Königswarta. This success enabled the Poles to establish a strong defensive position in the area, which soon became the starting point of a long defensive line stretching from Spreefeld in the east all of the way to the villages of Kamenz and Kuka to the northwest of Bautzen. This line was reinforced with fresh Soviet troops, and the Red Army Air Force had well and truly arrived in full force to the Saxon theatre as well, with hundreds of Soviet fighter planes now roaming the skies patrolling this new defense line. As a final measure, any remaining Polish and Soviet armoured units or infantry regiments operating to the south of this defensive line were ordered to pull back. This new defensive line was essentially the Poles and the Russians saying to the Germans, "You shall not pass." The establishment of this new defensive line represented an important shift in the Polish-Soviet battle plan, as they were now seemingly content to sacrifice control of most of Saxony to the Germans, as long as the Red Army maintained an iron grip on Brandenburg and the southern approaches to Berlin. Because as successful as the German counterattack in Saxony had been, including their relief of Bautzen and the recapture of Weissenberg, the real prize in all of the fighting was still Berlin. And both sides knew the capture of the capital by the Soviets would effectively end the war and spell defeat for the Germans. So from a Soviet perspective, whilst the defeat in Bautzen was a costly and painful humiliation, this loss could be tolerated as long as the Red Army's assault on Berlin remained undisturbed. On the 26th of April, the last significant pocket of Soviet resistance in Bautzen was snuffed out, when the 929th Rifle Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Bolsonovsky, was finally crushed by German troops. This regiment had been cut off and isolated for days, and by now, only a few riflemen and officers were left. Bolsonovsky had taken over command of the unit when the previous senior officer was killed, and he himself had been seriously wounded in the fighting. Unable to stand, he placed the regimental colours under his body, and he rallied his remaining troops for a last stand against the Germans. In the desperate fighting that followed, the handful of Soviet soldiers fought to the last man, and only when their ammunition ran out was their position finally wiped out. 2 weeks later, when the war ended, Bolsonovsky's body was found alongside those of his fallen men, with the blood-soaked regimental colours still underneath him. For his heroic last stand, he was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union. But despite these dramatic heroics, the mopping up operations in Bautzen were overwhelmingly characterized by scenes of brutality, inhumanity, and vengeance. For example, when the field hospital of the 254th Rifle Division was captured by the Germans, it's reported that all of the wounded soldiers were killed outright. And one source even recounts the story of how Seydlitz troops were found in Bautzen. Now, Seydlitz troops were pro-Soviet German prisoners of war tasked with causing havoc behind German lines. The story goes that 6 Seydlitz troops were found in the cellar of one house, printing pro-Soviet leaflets. Upon their discovery, they were immediately attacked by the German troops, and afterwards, their bodies were torn apart by an SS tank. The few remaining Soviet troops in the city barricaded themselves into cellars, or they stole civilian clothing to slip through the German lines or blend in with locals. But these were acts of desperation, for as soon as Soviet soldiers were discovered, they were denounced and shot immediately by German troops, as happened with 10 soldiers who were found and executed on Neustädter Straße. From the end of the fighting in Bautzen until the end of the war itself, the people of Bautzen continued to keep a close eye on any cellars, barns, or supposedly abandoned buildings, ever vigilant or paranoid that there might still be Soviet troops hiding out there. Even on the 2nd of May, almost a week after the city had been retaken, the Bautzener Tagesblatt was still warning people to watch out for Soviet soldiers, particularly those wearing stolen civilian clothes or German uniforms. They were told that if they saw any Soviet troops, they should immediately report this to the police, members of the Volkssturm, or town officials. The same went for any Wehrmacht deserters they came across as well. Outside of Bautzen, on the 26th of April, the 1st Hermann Göring Division successfully ejected the Polish 1st Armoured Corps from the village of Klein Welka, 4 kilometers to the northwest of Bautzen. And the Germans then followed up on this victory by capturing the nearby villages of Panowitz, Krinitz, and Loga. In Loga, it took 30 minutes of fierce house-to-house fighting before the Poles cut their losses and retreated. But this time, the Germans were prepared for the Polish withdrawal, and they flanked the escaping troops before they could complete their getaway. As a result, 600 Polish soldiers were captured. These victories led the Germans to believe that they had the Polish forces north of Bautzen on the run. The Germans were also eagerly awaiting the retreat of the Polish 9th Infantry Division through the area, a retreat they knew all about given their interception of the Polish orders. Near the town of Panschwitz-Kuckau, German forces, comprising elements of the Hermann Göring Division, infantry from the Brandenburg Division, and the Wittersheim Kampfgruppe, lay in wait for the Polish 9th Infantry Division to pass through as they retreated from Dresden. Blissfully unaware of the trap they were walking into, and tired from days of constant fighting and marching, the Polish division was completely unprepared for what happened next. As the Poles passed through a valley between the towns of Panschwitz-Kuckau and Krostwitz, they suddenly found themselves surrounded on all sides by German forces who immediately unleashed deadly waves of artillery, mortar, tank, and machine gun fire into the dense ranks of Polish troops. The valley the Poles passed through would later be called the Valley of Death. The Poles suffered tremendous losses, with estimates of up to 4,000 Polish soldiers being killed in the ambush. But apart from the human loss, the material loss was equally as devastating, with all of the 9th Infantry Division's vehicles and artillery pieces also being destroyed. No unit within the division was left untouched. But to give an example of just how successful the German ambush had been, the Polish 26th Infantry Regiment, for instance, lost 75% of its men. The 9th Infantry Division was more or less annihilated as an effective combat unit, and the few survivors who managed to reach Polish and Soviet lines were incorporated into the Soviet 19th Rifle Division. The Germans had been merciless in their onslaught, and the Wittersheim battle group in particular was noted for being an effective and enthusiastic participant in the ambush. As total as this German destruction of the 9th Infantry Division was, however, it represented one of the last significant engagements in the fighting around Bautzen, as the wider German counteroffensive started to run out of steam, and German forces found it increasingly difficult to continue their advance towards Spremberg. The German slowdown was caused by a combination of factors. Firstly, as the Germans pushed north, they were facing increasingly stiff resistance from a Polish-Soviet front line that was being reinforced with a seemingly endless supply of fresh troops, artillery pieces, guns, and heavy tanks, quickly dispatched south by the First Ukrainian Front. Moreover, the skies were full of Red Army fighter planes, which finally signaled the end of the Luftwaffe's efforts in Saxony, as the Soviets established air supremacy over the battlefield. Secondly, as we mentioned earlier, the Polish and Soviet forces were no longer interested in offensive operations, and they had instead turned their full focus to defensive operations. To this end, they established an impenetrable line to the south of Spremberg, consisting of tank traps, anti-tank guns, and hordes of infantry. To ram home the point, they then lay down thousands of mines. And lastly, German fuel supplies were running dangerously low, and many units had already spent their last reserves in the fighting around Bautzen. The remaining petrol they had was prioritized for the lead German tanks. But even with the siphoning of petrol from civilian vehicles, there simply wasn't enough to sustain the petrol-hungry tanks. All of those factors I've just outlined are on display in the fighting which took place in the final days of the battle. For example, on the 26th and 27th of April, the attacking German forces tried to dislodge the Polish-Soviet troops from the town of Neschwitz, roughly 12 kilometers northwest of Bautzen. But despite intense fighting which saw the town's castle change hands several times throughout the battle, the Germans were unable to break through the enemy lines. Taking an alternate route north, the Germans then launched an assault on the nearby village of Kaslau to the west of Neschwitz. Here, the Germans were immediately met by intense return fire from well-entrenched Polish and Soviet troops. On the 28th of April, the Germans were finally able to successfully capture Kaslau, but this proved to be a Pyrrhic victory for the Germans, because in order to take the village, they had been forced to launch a massive assault consisting of infantry, self-propelled guns, and tanks, backed up by almost continuous artillery barrages. Yes, the Germans captured Kaslau, but it seemed a heavy price to pay for a village which contained little more than a dozen houses. And as a result of this huge effort to capture such a tiny village, the Germans had exhausted their operational limit. So rather than using this as another springboard for a further advance, they simply dug in and constructed strong defensive positions instead. By now, the Germans realized that the Polish-Soviet forces ahead of them were simply too strong, and the small victories they were enjoying cost too much in terms of blood, fuel, and ammunition. And the villages which the Germans were managing to seize had no real strategic value anyway. Therefore, the Germans were forced to halt their advance, and they also established their own strong defensive line between Bautzen, Württemberg, and Weissenberg, with the intention of creating a barrier preventing any renewed Soviet or Polish drive south. This signaled the end of the German counterattack, as Army Group Center abandoned its rescue attempt of Berlin. This new static front line in Saxony between the Germans on one side and the Red Army forces on the other side would remain largely unchanged from now until the end of the war. Small clashes would continue behind the respective lines as isolated pockets of enemy troops were discovered and eliminated, but to all intents and purposes, the fighting in Saxony was over. And as soon as the front line stagnated in Saxony, the Germans, Soviets, and Poles started deploying their units to other theatres where the fighting was still raging. For example, on the 30th of April, the joint Polish and Soviet forces which had launched the invasion of Saxony only 2 weeks earlier were redeployed to support the Red Army's advance on Prague. Whereas on the German side, some elements of the Brandenburg Division were also transferred to Czechoslovakia, with other elements of the division retreating into the Erzgebirge Mountains. They were joined by the 1st Hermann Göring Division, which after being transferred north of Dresden, also retreated into the Erzgebirge Mountains, flanked by columns of German refugees. Both divisions would still be in the mountains when they heard of Germany's surrender on the 8th of May. The 20th Panzer Division, meanwhile, was deployed to the area north of Dresden, and they also ended their war in Czechoslovakia, surrendering to Red Army troops on the 6th of May. Although some elements did slip westwards and tried surrendering to the Americans near Pilsen. This just delayed the inevitable, however, as the Americans handed them straight back to the Russians. Oberst Dietrich Höpke, meanwhile, the man who had won plaudits leading the garrison of Bautzen during the dark days of the Soviet assault on the city, joined the German forces who were deployed to Czechoslovakia. When he heard of Germany's surrender on the 8th of May, he did the only thing a fanatical Nazi could do in the circumstances. He committed suicide. And so after all the fighting, and for all the blood that was shed to secure Bautzen and the rest of Saxony, Germany had lost the war anyway, less than 2 weeks later. The people of Bautzen now faced the task of rebuilding their city, wondering what would become of them under the years of Soviet occupation ahead. So a fair question to ask would be, given that Bautzen was to fall under the Soviet zone of occupation less than 2 weeks after the Battle of Bautzen had finished, was the German counterattack to relieve the city even worth it? This question will be the focus of our next and final episode in this series, when we look at the debate which has raged ever since about the Battle of Bautzen and its legacy.